Okay, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. My name is Lilian Christine Hibner. I'm a professor and researcher in the fields of psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil. Today, we have the honor and the pleasure to listen to Dr. Mark Liberman from University of Pennsylvania at this Abralin-supported event, Linguists Online. As you know, Linguists Online, Abralin ao Vivo, is a promotion of Abralin, the Brazilian Association of Linguistics, in cooperation with several international associations, among them the Permanent International Committee of Linguists, the Latin American Association of Linguists and Philology, the Argentinian Society of Linguistic Studies, the Spanish Society of Linguistics, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, the Australian Linguistic Society, and the British Association for Applied Linguistics. I'd like to thank Abralin for giving me the privilege to moderate this session. So I'm very delighted today to introduce Dr. Mark Liberman, who so kindly accepted our invitation to give a talk. Dr. Liberman is professor and researcher at the University of Pennsylvania at the School of Arts and Sciences. He is the director of the Linguistic Data Consortium. His main research focuses are corpus-based phonetics, legal, medical, and political applications of linguistic analysis, the phonology and phonetics of lexical tone and its relationship to intonation, formal models for linguistic annotation, information retrieval and information extraction from text, gestural, prosodic, morphological, and synthetic ways of marking focus and their use in discourse. His talk is entitled Clinical Applications of Linguistic Analysis, Opportunities and Challenges. You can write your comments and questions in the chat, and Professor Liberman will be happy to answer them at the end of this talk. Dr. Liberman, thank you again for having accepted our invitation.
And thank you for having invited me. It's a pleasure and an honor to speak with you and your audience today. So I'm going to start some slides and share my screen. And so I hope you're seeing the right thing. I believe so. The idea of this work is that there's a lot of information beyond the text in the way someone talks. There are personal characteristics, there are contextual characteristics like mood and attitude, there are physiological characteristics like fatigue or intoxication, and there are many clinical diagnostic categories that have symptoms that are manifest, sometimes primarily manifest in spoken interaction. Autism spectrum disorder, neurodegenerative disorders, mood disorders, schizophrenia, and so on. And the development of modern speech and language technology makes it possible in principle to create automated methods for diagnostic screening and monitoring. One of the important benefits for that in principle would be the fact that these diagnostic categories are what the clinicians call phenotypically diverse, which a friend of mine jokes is Greek for we have no effing clue. These categories represent sometimes apparently discontinuous regions of very complex multidimensional behavioral spaces. And we can hope that automated analysis of very large data sets may allow us to do better science, learn what is really going on in these behavioral spaces, and also develop convenient and inexpensive and psychometrically reliable ways to screen and to estimate the efficacy of treatments. So I'm going to present some suggestive preliminary results, discuss future research opportunities, and existing barriers to progress. So One obvious sample problem is neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's disease, which every one of us is likely to develop sooner or later if something else doesn't kill us first. There is no cure. There have been many drugs that pharmaceutical companies have tested, and all of the trials have failed so far. This may be, one theory is that this is because the developers are targeting the wrong physiology. And that may very well be true. That is, the tau proteins and plaques and tangles that they're trying to attack may be symptoms rather than causes. But also, the diagnosis of these conditions depends on passing a very low threshold on a set of cognitive tests. And it's likely that by the time you pass that threshold, you've been suffering from the disorder for 10 or 15 years, and it may very well be too late to intervene. So it would be good if we could diagnose based on rates of change rather than on absolute level of performance. But there are not really any tests that are normed for longitudinal administration, for giving over and over again. And it's not practical in any event to bring people in for an hour to the clinic once a month for 10 or 20 years in order to track their scoring on those tests. If we could do easy and accurate longitudinal tracking, there would be other benefits. We need it in order to evaluate the efficacy of interventions. If you want to know whether diet or exercise or doing certain kind of puzzles or whatever is protective or therapeutic, if you want to know whether a certain drug really works over a longer period of time, you would like to be able to do longitudinal tracking of the symptoms. And another sad fact about these disorders is that there's no very good way to predict the time course of the disease. If I go to the doctor today and she gives me a battery of tests and concludes that I suffer from mild cognitive impairment, and I say, well, okay, doctor, but what's going to happen to me in the future? If she's honest, she has to say that she really doesn't know, that it could be that 10 years from now, I'll be pretty much like I am, except maybe a little bit more forgetful, or it could be that in 5 or 10 years, I'll be dead from the consequences of the disorder. Now, the standard neurocognitive tests that are used in these test batteries could in principle be administered over the internet and scored automatically. And there's even better news, which is that modern analysis methods can tell us a lot from these tests that traditional pencil and paper scoring would miss. There are similar arguments for other behavioral disorders, autism spectrum disorder, mood disorders, schizophrenia, and so on. Convenient automated tracking would facilitate screening and differential diagnosis, evaluation of behavioral and pharmaceutical interventions, research into cause and effects. And eventually, the formal tests that neuropsychologists now use might be replaced by interactions that are more interesting and even fun. Although one of my neurologist colleagues explained to me that neurologists are not into fun. They might also eventually be replaced by some kind of daily life monitoring via our normal set of network devices, but one step at a time. We have to start with what people can use now. So what can modern analysis methods tell us from the kind of tasks that are used in these test batteries now? How might virtual administration of such test batteries actually work? And how could we give such tests repeatedly with reliable results? And maybe along the way, what does all of this have to do with linguistics? So let me back off for a minute and talk about the context, which is that the past 50 years have seen enormous quantitative changes in speech and language research thanks to advances in digital technology. We've moved from a situation where even reliable, inexpensive tape recording was something new to a situation in which almost arbitrary amounts of audio and video recording can be created and stored digitally and searched and processed efficiently. And the future is going to bring even larger changes, not only quantitative changes in the productivity of our research, the scale of our research, but also qualitative changes in the methods that we can employ. There are new sources of data, new methods of automated analysis that in principle are opening up vast new territories for our research. Because we can easily acquire and manage new sources of data, several orders of magnitude bigger than in the past, and the new methods can also do old tasks orders of magnitude more efficiently, so we can explore these new data sets in old ways as well as new ways with much less human labor. And we can experiment with completely new approaches to analysis and modeling. These new methodologies are rapidly spreading everywhere into all disciplines and applications where speech and language and communicative interaction are involved. But unfortunately, there are some scientific, technical, and professional cultures that are decades behind the times in ways that are seriously retarding research and development. And the most notable examples are medicine and education. I'm not going to be talking about education today, but I will be talking about some aspects of biomedical research. What are these fields missing out on? Well, they've never adopted what in other fields has come to be called the common task method. This is a research and development approach and a way of building research communities that's based on very large bodies of shared training and testing data, well-defined quantitative evaluation metrics, and community based on that shared data and sort of competition to see whose results, whose methods can score best on the evaluation metrics. Now, why don't medicine and education get it? Well, there are legal, ethical, and cultural factors, but actually, I think that's not the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, why do other areas like human language technology and image processing and plenty of others routinely use these proven and powerful approaches? So the easy answer is that people use these methods because they work, but that's only part of the story. For the rest of the answer, I want to give a brief sketch of the last 50 years of intellectual history for research and development in human language technology. So what do I mean by human language technology? Well, these are systems we're all familiar with by now, but their inputs could be audio or video that includes people communicating, texts, and complex semi-structured collections of recordings and texts, data structures that represent evolving understanding of these collections. And the outputs could be computer-created audio and video streams, for example, synthetic voice, synthetic text, additions to the data structures that represent evolving understanding, and the relevant technological capabilities or applications, again, are familiar to us. They include speech recognition, otherwise known as speech to text, machine translation, information retrieval, information extraction, summarization, question answering, optical character recognition, speaker and language identification, so-called sentiment analysis, dialogue management, and so on. And human language technology in this sense is booming. There are large companies like Amazon and Google and Apple and IBM and Microsoft and so forth that employ them, but there are also plenty of startups and smaller companies employing them. And there are three secrets, there are three reasons why these technologies are booming. One is their cheap, fast digital hardware, which expands the range of situations in which you can apply them. Ubiquitous digital networking, which does the same thing. But then there's this research management technique that was developed in the 1980s and has been applied increasingly widely since then. Those first two driving forces, cheap, fast digital hardware and ubiquitous digital networking, are obvious. But the third one, as I've said, involves some intellectual history, which is actually worth learning about. And the background to this, before this technique was developed, was a series of human language technology failures. In the 60s and 70s, there were many projects that were focused on machine translation, natural language interaction with databases, speech recognition, and speech synthesis. These approaches were based on human-coded rules or constraints. That is, people wrote programs to literally recognize speech or translate text. And they generally worked to some extent, but they were limited in scope. They were brittle under even modest changes in context. They were expensive to create and to port to new applications. And they were generally somewhat disappointing in performance anyhow. And a lot of influential people in the 1960s and 70s concluded that these endeavors were simply hopeless. And a leader in pushing this narrative was John Pierce. He supervised the team that built the first transistor. He oversaw development of the first communications satellite, so his opinion carried considerable weight. This is what engineers looked like in the 1950s and 1960s. John Pierce was the founder of the organization at Bell Labs that I worked in for 15 years after my PhD. So I participated in his legacy there. He chaired a committee for the National Academy of Sciences that concluded that investment in machine translation should be pared back, and people should be very careful with it. And Pierce wrote that, because it was a committee report, that was somewhat diplomatic, but he wrote an article for the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in the late 1960s called Wither Speech Recognition, where he could express his own opinion rather crudely. He said, a general phonetic typewriter is simply impossible unless the typewriter has an intelligence and a knowledge of language comparable to those of a native speaker of English. Most recognizers behave not like scientists, but like mad inventors or untrustworthy engineers. The typical recognizer, by which he means a researcher working on speech recognition, gets it into his head that he can solve the problem. The basis for this is either individual inspiration, the mad engineer source of knowledge, or acceptance of untested rules, schemes, or information, the untrustworthy engineer approach. The typical recognizer builds or programs an elaborate system that either does very little or flops in an obscure way. A lot of money and time are spent. No simple, clear, sure knowledge is gained. The work has been an experience, not an experiment. And then he went on to be even more frank. We are safe in asserting that speech recognition is attractive to money. The attraction is perhaps similar to the attraction of schemes for turning water into gasoline, extracting gold from the sea, curing cancer, or going to the moon. One doesn't attract thoughtlessly given dollars by means of schemes for cutting the cost of soap by 10%. To sell suckers, one uses deceit and offers glamour. It is clear that glamour and any deceit in the field of speech recognition blind the takers of funds as much as they blind the givers of funds. Thus, we may pity workers whom we cannot respect. So there was a period following that that involved an attempt to apply the techniques of classical artificial intelligence and made some progress, but was generally regarded as a failure and was cut off early after 3 years. But about a decade later, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency restarted support of human language technology research because some smart program managers had an idea to design a program that would protect against glamour and deceit, because there would be a well-defined objective evaluation metric. In the old days, evaluation had basically been by evaluation by demo. You would bring in some admirals and generals and managers, and the researchers would give them a scripted demonstration, which, if they were good at that kind of production, might be impressive, even if the underlying technology didn't really work very well. The evaluation metric in this new program would be applied by a neutral agent, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. In those days, it was the National Bureau of Standards, on shared data sets. And you would ensure that simple clear, sure knowledge is gained because the participants would be required to reveal their methods to the sponsor and to one another at the time that the evaluation results are presented. So to do this, you need published data and well-defined metrics, as Dave Pallett from the National Bureau of Standards wrote in 1975, tests that make use of speech databases that are not made available to others and for which the test procedures and results are poorly documented, provide little objective information on system performance. This is something well known to people in the computer industry. You wouldn't really trust a computer maker to give you comparative benchmarks that they invented, comparing their machines to other people's machines, because they would be sorely tempted to craft the benchmarks in such a way as to give themselves an advantage in any way they might finagle the tests anyhow. So this motivated what I'm calling the common task structure. So a detailed task definition and evaluation plan, which are developed in consultation with researchers, is published as the very first step in the project. There's automatic evaluation software, which is written and maintained by a trusted third party and is also published at the start of the project. There's shared data. Large amounts of training and development test data is published at the start of the project. So-called evaluation test data is withheld, not shown to the researchers for periodic public evaluations. Now, not everybody liked this. Many followers of John Pierce were skeptical. I remember one of them saying to me, "You can't turn water into gasoline no matter what you measure." And many researchers were disgruntled. One of them said to me, "It's like being in first grade again. You're told exactly what to do and then you're tested over and over." But it worked. It worked for several reasons. The most obvious one was that it allowed funding to start, because research progress requires that people have the leisure and the resources to work on the research. The projects were perceived as glamour and deceit proof, and so the spigot of funding could be turned on. And it allowed funding to continue because the funders could measure progress over time and justify the money that they were investing, even though the technology might be a decade or more away from any practical application. A less obvious reason for success was that this approach allowed project internal hill climbing. Because the evaluation metrics were automatic and the code was public, this obvious way of working was a new idea to many researchers, but the same people who had objected to being tested twice a year began testing themselves every hour, or at least as frequently as they could revise and rerun their code. And perhaps the least obvious thing is that it created a research culture, because the researchers shared methods and results on shared data with a common metric, and participation in this culture became so valuable that many research groups joined even without funding in order to ride the wave, so to speak. So because it created this sort of positive feedback loop, when everyone's program has to interpret the same ambiguous evidence, ambiguity resolution, which is after all what is going on in natural language technology in general, in speech recognition or machine translation or whatever, ambiguity resolution becomes a sort of gambling game. And this rewards the use of statistical methods, and it led directly to the flowering of so-called machine learning. Given the nature of speech and language, these methods need the largest possible training set, which reinforce the value of shared data, and the iterated train and test cycles on this gambling game, I think, are probably literally addictive. That is, the researchers who work this way are subject to the same dopamine squirts as someone in a casino who's pulling the lever repeatedly on a one-armed bandit on a slot machine. So this method has become the standard research paradigm in what we might call experimental computational science, wherever you can set up well-defined training and testing data, well-defined evaluation metrics, techniques to avoid overfitting. The domain in general is anything that involves algorithmic analysis of the natural world, which certainly includes, for example, diagnosis and tracking of behaviorally defined brain disorders. Over the past few decades, this method has been applied to many other problems, lots of problems in the human language technology area, but also problems like video analysis and picture image analysis and so on that don't necessarily involve speech or language. The general experience is that error rates decline by a fixed percentage each year to an asymptote that depends on task and data quality. And the progress usually comes from many small improvements. It's not so much that there's a single invention, or there are lots of important inventions, but each of them makes typically a relatively small change in the quality of the technology. This is a little bit like what's happened in, for example, the automobile industry, where the standard automobile engine is not all that different fundamentally from the engines in automobiles built in 1915 or 1920, but it's much, much better. It's cheaper, it's more reliable, it's longer lasting, it's more efficient. And that's not because there was a single invention that changed everything, but rather an accumulation of smaller changes in materials and manufacturing and design. And shared data has played a crucial role and has been reused in unexpected ways, and glamour and deceit have been mostly, if not entirely, avoided. So it's important to recognize that this approach was originally imposed by funders from the top down on a collection of researchers who were mostly opposed to it and even actively disgruntled until they were converted by experience. And the funders themselves were originally motivated in large part by the skepticism of their management. So to some extent, this success was a happy accident. And versions of this model, however, are now routinely used outside of sponsored projects by both academic and industrial researchers who create challenges by technical societies and ad hoc groups. But there's several important areas that are, in general, with a few exceptions, lagging behind, both in technology and methodology. And as I said, clinical applications are probably primary among them. These lagging areas share the need to improve fundamental enabling technologies like what's called in the trade diarization of real-world conversations, that is, figuring out who spoke when. But the key barriers to progress are the lack of significant quantities of shared data and the failure to construct and promulgate standard quantitative evaluation metrics. So I'm going to focus on one important area of inadequate data, which are recordings of clinical interviews, neuropsychological tests, and similar things. Now, there are obviously policies and laws and ethical concerns that require such recordings to be treated in a special way. And they're widely, but I think falsely, but clearly, I know falsely believed to make cross-site sharing impossible. So why do we want such recordings for research, and why do we want to share them? Well, speech and language, as I suggested before, provide key behavioral markers. They're cheaper and less invasive than brain imaging, blood tests, genomic tests, but they're often diagnostically more useful because many of these disorders are defined only in behavioral terms. And the problems are phenotypically diverse, meaning that we don't really understand them very well. With enough data and enough research, we can hope to figure out what's really going on, and easy automated longitudinal tracking would allow earlier diagnosis as well as efficient evaluation of the efficacy of interventions. But a single site never has enough data for really exploring the behavioral space or for psychometrically norming longitudinal tracking. When you look at publications in this area, it's typical for them to have n equals 30, n equals 100, rarely, sometimes more, but rarely much more than that. And more, even if you had more data than that, no single research team is likely to have all of the relevant techniques, all the relevant ideas to try, all the relevant routes to the answer. We need to pool data sets across sites so that we can have a very large number of examples, and we need a community of researchers who are working together to understand them. So this motivates, in my opinion, a serious effort to find ways to share clinical speech and language data in consistent and accessible ways on a large scale. But even small and limited data sets can yield promising results from simple techniques. And since in this domain, there is unfortunately no top-down leadership, so for example, the National Institutes of Health in the US is not yet doing what DARPA did in the 1980s. We can hope that a bottom-up demonstration of success will lead to needed cultural changes. So the first example I'm going to take a look at is so-called autism spectrum disorders. It's clear that autism is not really a spectrum that is a single dimension, but rather a space with many dimensions, a space that we all live in, with some corners that have been medicalized because they cause serious life problems. Now, is there suitable digital data out there? Yes, there's something called the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, ADOS for short. It's a standard diagnostic tool, at least in North America. It consists of a multi-part structured interview, which is video recorded and scored from the video with half a dozen scoring rubrics for each of the 12 segments. And for diagnosis, the multiple scores are added up and thresholded. And there are versions for subjects of different ages, and it's used in different languages, I believe, as well. I don't know exactly how many have been given, but I think the order of magnitude is 1 million because it's a standard diagnostic tool and there are thousands of sites that use it. The recording is stored on a DVD disc, which is stored in the patient's folder, at least for the clinicians that I'm familiar with. And we've started a collaboration with the Center for Autism Research at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, which has 3,000 or more such recordings. With their help, we selected an initial set of 100 that included interviews with neurotypical controls and adolescents with other diagnoses like ADHD. We did some preliminary work to persuade the hospital's institutional review board that it was both possible and worthwhile to share 20-minute audio segments for research purposes, and we will be publishing anonymized versions of the audio of those recordings later this year with appropriate safeguards. So this pilot corpus is about 33 hours of speech, which is tiny by modern standards, but our analysis suggests that basically every sensible linguistic measurement, and we only can use very simple ones with small amounts of data like this, but every sensible measurement shows some interesting signal. And we hope to persuade other clinical centers eventually to join us in creating a much larger collection. Bob Schultz, the director of the Center for Autism Research, said, with 10,000 interviews, maybe we can figure out what's really going on. So simple bag of words classification, that is, you just take the histogram, the count of who used how many words in their side of the conversation, using a naive Bayes weighted log odds ratio, leave one out, cross-validation. To my surprise, this correctly classified 68% of the ASD participants and 100% of the typical participants with an area under the curve of 85%. I think it's unlikely that this will, in fact, I know for sure that this won't generalize across other kinds of conversations, but because this is a semi-structured interview where certain topics are brought up, it's likely to work in this kind of situation. Mean word duration as a function of phrase length also shows a difference. The typically developing participants spoke the fastest. The non-ASD mixed clinical group was next, and the ASD group was the slowest. Latency to respond, that is, after the clinician asks a question, how long does it take for the subject to begin to answer? And ASD is shorter than typically developing. Fundamental frequency variation. The mean absolute deviation from the median, calculated in semitones from the speaker's 5th percentile, shows that for the ASD subjects, the mean absolute deviation from the median is both higher in general, but also more variable than the non-ASD mixed clinical group, and certainly than the typically developing group. And this variability may help to explain why you find in the literature confident statements like, as is well known, autistic children have monotone speech, or as is well known, autistic children have sing-song speech. I think what those things really mean is that the children suffering from this disorder sometimes have speech which is prosodically unexpected in the context. The rate of production in the different groups varies. Here it's scored as divided by over versus the proportion of filled pauses over words in general. And the minimum value for the typically developing group was 58.1%, and 23 of 65 participants in the ASD group fell below that value. For this feature, there's a very large gender difference. In this graph, we're showing the male ASD kids, adolescents in this case, in green with green M's, and the females with red F's. And you can see that the females have a distribution which is like that of the typically developing kids, whereas the males, there's a subset of the males at least that look different. And these subgroup differences also showed up in some 5-minute get-to-know-you conversations that we've analyzed along with our colleagues at the Center for Autism Research. I'm not going to go over the details here, but the point is that the ASD females are different from the ASD males, but also different from the typically developing males and females. And sometimes the sex differences are different from that, but in any event, you need to be able to look at males and females differently in order to be able to sort out those particular measures. And without any question, there are going to be other relevant subgroups as well. As I said, in general, almost every measurement has some signal, but we also see phenotypic diversity, which underlines the fact that we want a large enough sample to find the clusters or dimensions within as well as across groups. But even in this very simple initial analysis, these are 5-minute unstructured non-clinical conversations. So the subjects are probably only talking for about 2 minutes of these get-to-know-you conversations. And yet we're able, with very simple automated features extracted automatically, to achieve an F-score accuracy and precision of about 76%, 0.76, comparing ASD to TD. So this is just a start. We need to expand the sample size, enlarge the age range. These are all adolescents. We'd like to be able to diagnose toddlers based on their early vocalizations, because early diagnosis is really important in this case, because there are behavioral interventions that are known to make a large difference in the life experience of the kids who are diagnosed and trained. We'd like to explore new measures and new covariates, textual and acoustic phonetic features, integration of features, things like gesture and gaze and posture during conversation, other phenotypic data, neuroimaging, genetics, and so on. Now, there are lots of other kinds of data sets that are relevant for ASD research and lots of possible targets for similar research. And I'm next going to go into some examples of neurodegenerative disorders. As I said, this is a kind of disease that all of us are likely to suffer from eventually if we don't die of something else first. And I could have talked about mood disorders and schizophrenia and other mental conditions, but I won't because of lack of time. But in every case that we've looked at, there are simple properties of speech and language data that correlate with clinical categories. For example, we've been working with Penn's Frontotemporal Dementia Center on a data set of picture description recordings from which they've collected over the past couple of decades from around 1,600 patients in elderly controls. And in this case, again, simple language independent acoustic phonetic measures have significant potential value in diagnosis and monitoring. This is the picture that's described. It won't be a surprise to you that this picture has been used since the middle of the 20th century. It's a typical sort of 1950s or 1960s suburban American white bread kitchen with a mother in her apron doing dishes and ignoring the fact that the sink is overflowing, and some kids who are attempting to steal cookies from a cookie jar on a high shelf off to the left, and the driveway and lawn outside the window. So here we're comparing. HC stands for healthy controls. Here blue stands for, or BVFTD in blue stands for behavioral variant frontotemporal degeneration. This is a category of neurodegenerative disorder where the standard story about it is that there are not speech and language symptoms. The sort of canonical description of BVFTD is that it involves loss of inhibition, loss of inhibitory control. So somebody with BVFTD might walk into a restaurant, see something on a stranger's plate that attracts their attention, reach over and pick it up and put it in their mouth and eat it, even though that's something that we all might have the impulse to do, but all of us would reject the impulse and not do it. But there are linguistic differences. For example, looking down here at the bottom, the BVFTD subjects in red, in blue, have shorter speech segments overall compared to the healthy controls in red, and they have longer pause durations compared to the healthy controls in red. And just the acoustic classifiers are able to do a decent job of differentiating several different varieties of frontotemporal degeneration. There's so-called non-fluent agrammatic progressive aphasia. There's semantic variant PPA, primary progressive aphasia. There's logopedic variant primary progressive aphasia. You don't really need to know the ways in which those diagnoses are different, except to understand that there are differences in the underlying pathology, which parts of the brain are typically involved, and also differences that neurologists learn to glean from various kinds of tests in order to make a differential diagnosis. And some simple lexical features are also relevant. So the semantic variant primary progressive aphasia produced more words that are more abstract, words that are more ambiguous, words that are more frequent, words that are to some extent more familiar. There was no really significant difference in age of acquisition, but they did show lower cross entropy. That is, their words are more predictable on the basis of sort of general expectations about what people might say. This goes along with using higher frequency words. The ratio of content to function words is also different for the different categories. These are the controls, the behavioral variant frontotemporal degeneration, the non-fluent agrammatic primary progressive aphasia, the semantic variant primary progressive aphasia. And when you combine lexical and acoustic features, you get even better results. Macro average F-score in the 0.81 to 0.86 range, and area under the curve for the macro average of 0.9, which is really pretty good, especially considering that this is based on roughly 1 minute of speech in a picture description task. And with more sources of data and more modes of analysis of that kind of data, we could hope to do even better. Again, the fact that we're dealing with relatively small n in these cases, even though we're dealing with a very large set of patients, a very large set of picture description recordings, the sort of validated patient populations are more in the tens to 100 range. So the good news is that picture descriptions give a lot of useful diagnostic information, which is why neurologists use them. The task is quick and easy to automate using a web app. So this task could be part of a longitudinal test battery measuring linguistic and cognitive skills across time. But the bad news is that with small data sets, we can only use very basic features because of a lot of the things that linguists would like to look at don't happen all that frequently. And so if we want to compare their frequency or their distribution in people with one diagnosis versus people with another diagnosis, or how they progress with normal aging or whatever, how they vary with gender, with years of education, with whatever other covariates we want to look at, we would need much, much more data. And also, repeated description of the same picture is problematic if we want to track someone over 10 or 20 years. Having them describe the same stupid cookie theft picture once a month for 36 months is going to get old very fast. There are only a couple of commonly used pictures. And even for those, there's no basis for psychometric norming of repeated administration. So it would also be nice to have some pictures that are more modern and more inclusive. This is one of the new pictures that we've arranged to have created. It has a similar number of diverse activities in different parts of the picture. It's in color. It's a scene in a public pool that anyone who lives in a town or city could probably relate to. So we're planning to create a significant number of suitable pictures or short animations, get thousands of pictures, descriptions of each picture to permit psychometrically stable automated measures, combine this with other standard tasks that can be automated. The standard test batteries, putting them all together, involve 20 or 30 tasks, a majority of which actually are speech mediated, although some of them involve drawing or pointing or multiple choice. But other tasks are things like digit span, that is remembering different numbers of digits, so-called category fluency, which is like how many names for animals can you think of in a minute. Free recall, which is given a list of N words to memorize, how many of them can you remember after some period of distraction. So-called logical memory, which is the name that's used in this field for recalling a story. How many features of a story that you were told do you correctly recall? And you'd have to get subject consent for data distribution, if not publication. This doesn't mean that you put the data up on the web for anybody to see. It means that the data is distributed with some kind of controls to people who agree to limit what they do with the data, including not de-identifying it and not, ridiculing the subjects and so on. And we've started a web-based pilot project. So here's the web page about it. And this is just a description of the collection. And you can log in and register to start. And we've only collected about 250 sessions so far. Sorry, about 450 sessions so far. But we would like to have 10,000 sessions. So please all participate. And we haven't started systematically advertising this on social media and other serious advertising media yet. So we're hopeful to get a very large number of participants. And we would like to cooperate with people in other countries with other languages. I've found that people that I speak to about this in France, in Germany, in China, in Russia, perhaps in Brazil, are eager to at least talk about the possibility of doing something similar in order to get data in their own language for comparison. So please go to speechbiomarkers.org, participate. Even if you're not a native English speaker, as long as you can do this in English, one of the pieces of metadata that we ask for is what your language background is. I should say that this is not all my work or even primarily my work. Here's a partial list of people who have been involved in the things that I've talked about. People from the Frontotemporal Degeneration Center at Penn, people from the Linguistic Data Consortium at Penn, people from the Center for Autism Research at the Children's Hospital, someone from Rowan University, someone from Northwell Health on Long Island. And actually there are hundreds of people around the world who are working on similar kinds of research and from whom I've learned. So I'm hoping that this is a rising and not setting sun, and I'm now ready to take questions.
Okay, thank you so much for this brilliant talk. We learned a lot today. It was really amazing. Thank you so much. I took notes of some of the questions from the audience. So I'm gonna choose some of them for you to answer, please. Let me see. First one. This question came from Leticia. She asks, which tools or approaches are used nowadays in order to find more precise information about language in neurological pathologies in aging? Or so, which tools have been used?
Well, so you can probably answer that question better than I can, since you work in that area. But what I see from the outside is that the standard test batteries were mostly developed several decades ago, and therefore are mostly administered live and scored with pencil and paper. So for example, if you're doing digit span, you give someone some number of digits to remember, and you mark down whether they got it right or not. With the logical memory task, you tell them a story and you ask them to repeat the story, perhaps after an intervening time of distraction, and then you mark down which features of the story they remember and which they don't. And there are standard ways to turn those pencil and paper notations into numbers, and then the numbers are added up.
Okay.
There are some other things. Some of them are more subjective. In one of the test batteries that I've seen, you ask the person to try to stand on one leg. And the question is, can they balance? And if motor disorders are an issue, you ask them to hold out their hand and you see whether there's a tremor, and so on. But is that a fair description of what the standard techniques are?
Okay.
But what we're not the only people doing this, what people have started to do is to take these same tasks and start looking at other features. Like we've looked at the very simple things like the distribution of speech segments and silent segment durations, or the distribution of different parts of speech, or the distribution of certain kinds of disfluencies, or for the words that people say, if we have a transcript, the word frequency, word familiarity, word concreteness, because those can be different for different diagnoses. There are people who think that in things like the so-called fluency tasks, where you're asked for the word, how many words starting with F, or how many names of animals or fruits or whatever, can you mention, that it matters to what extent the words are semantically associated. Mm-hmm. That having many words that are semantically associated as opposed to relatively few words that are semantically associated is a relevant feature.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many fields, so many aspects in language that we can test. As you talked about a lot about of speech, of prosody, of in the lexical and semantic aspects, and we still could talk about syntax, complexity, yeah. Discourse, yes. And then another question that came from the audience. I'm gonna skip some here. We don't have so much time, but the first, let me see, another just going here, yeah, about collaborative shared data. I think that we are heading, in many fields, we are heading to this area of collaborating, of sharing, right? Because if you think that money funding have been done for research, so this should be inherently collaborative, yeah? But then the question is, how can we do this? Because me in our group, we work with this too, but we know that there are lots of ways for you to segment the sentences. So how do you feel, how do you think that we could have this a bank, a collaborative between countries when we have different languages and different ways of notation? So how for instance, the data that you direct, the group that you direct, how can people contribute for your data, or how are there norms, let's say for segmenting?
Well, I think actually by now the LDC has published data in something like 50 or 60 languages. But fairly significant amounts in 15 or 20 languages. Now, unfortunately, the formats are not always the same, but the annotation formats. But we do insist that the annotation formats are machine readable, that is, they're consistent. And what that means is that, and we encourage people to use standard formats, and there are some. But what that means is that even if the formats are different, it is possible to intertranslate them in principle. Okay. You can read something in one that's transcribed or segmented or annotated in one system and make it available or move it together with another, to the extent that the differences are only syntactic. Unfortunately, in many cases, the differences have to do not with form, but with content. That's true even for things like subject metadata. So if you're combining pools of data, and let's say even for something simple as age, some data sets have year of birth, some data sets have age at time of recording, yes. Some data sets divide things into younger, middle-aged, and older, or other sort of ordinal categories like that. And so that life is hard sometimes. Yeah. But as we begin to cooperate, I think we can increasingly agree on shared content, at least, mm-hmm. and to some extent on shared form, especially to the extent that we also share tools. But I would also emphasize that sharing data, although it's really important, is not in itself enough. And I'm going to share my screen again with another example. Whoops. I can, but I'm not sharing my screen. Hold on a minute. Let me. Not yet. I have to share my screen first. Mm-hmm. And then I can Okay, it is now shared, and now
Good.
I'm going to the slide that I want to show. Okay, so there's something called the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, known as ADNI. This was organized starting in 2004 by the National Institutes of Health. So I'm about to show us a slide by Neil Buchholz from the National Institute on Aging. He was the person who really started this effort. And this was a conference in 2011, transforming research through open access to discovery, inputs, and outputs, all to the good, you know, the sort of open data movement. Whoops, I'm not going to show you the open access thing. Rather, I'm going to show you his slide. Hello. Oops. Here we are. So this is his slide. Longitudinal multi-site observational study. Great, right? Major goal is collection of data and samples to establish a brain imaging biomarker and clinical database in order to identify the best markers for following disease progression and monitoring treatment response. Unfortunately, by biomarker, he means things like blood tests and cerebrospinal fluid tests. I made an attempt to persuade the ADNI people to include some, even just a minute's worth of speech samples, but they were reluctant because apparently the clinicians who were cooperating were already annoyed that they had to do all this stuff that was required by ADNI participation, and they didn't want anything more. Anyway, determine the optimal methods for acquiring, processing, and distributing images and biomarkers in conjunction with clinical and neuropsychological data in a multi-site context. Validate imaging and biomarker data by correlating with neuropsychological and clinical data. Rapid public access to all data and access to samples. And this really happened. There's an ADNI site. You can go to the site. You do have to apply. You have to persuade them that you are a bona fide researcher and you have something to contribute, but you don't actually have to be an Alzheimer's researcher. You could be a computer scientist who has some new ideas about image processing or something like that, and you would get the data. But unfortunately, there was no well-defined versioning of the data sets. So that means that when you apply, you get whatever they have at the time that you get the data. And there's never been any evaluation metric. Since they're interested in predicting disease prognosis, it would make sense to say, okay, here's 300 patients, here's 3 years of their data. Now we're going to withhold what we get the next year, and you have to predict the next 2 years or whatever, the next year, and we'll see how well you can do, but they never did that. There have been no focused workshops comparing attempts to do predictions on the data. And frankly, in my opinion, the result has been no progress. So it's good that they did this, but it really hasn't had much of an impact. It means that there's more data of this kind available, but it really hasn't. I mean, maybe the information isn't in there, but they really haven't given a fair shot to the methods that I'm talking about to find it.
Okay, thank you. Let's see another question. Let me see. Data in autism is usually hard to collect because of the peculiarities and sensitivity related to the environment of the patients. Yeah, so when we work with clinical population, it's really hard. There is a comment made here by the audience. Then we have a question raised by Camila. She said, she stated here, Lisa Mosconi stated on a TED Talk that menopause might be related to Alzheimer's. Do you think such tests could be applied to detect early stages of the disease in women, on women?
Well, so menopause is not one of the kinds of metadata that we're asking for, but we do ask for gender and age. So if there were an effect of that kind, it ought to show up. This is not something I actually know anything about. Let me come back to that in a minute and respond to the comment about the difficulty of, or the issues involved in collecting clinical autism data from ASD patients and from clinical populations in general. And my observation is simply that in clinical interviews, we can do nearly as well in diagnosis working with the clinician's speech as with the subject's speech, because the clinicians are, I mean, perhaps they're acting differently from what they kind of know or guess about the patient, but mostly their interaction with the patient is modulated by the way that the subject responds. So it's actually important to look at both sides of the interaction. And actually, one thing we don't know about this attempt to get automated virtual data collected on the internet without an interviewer or a clinician being involved is what the effects of that will be. And of course, for people who are showing serious symptoms, there's going to be a problem because when you look at the picture description interviews with people who are having serious FTD or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's symptoms, there's a lot of sort of prompting and helping by the clinician interviewer. And that's not really so necessary with subjects who aren't in that category. But to the extent that, but the goal, at least our goal, is mainly to track normal aging and early onset symptoms. So I'm hoping that will be less of an issue. But even if it turns out that there's some kinds of things for which we really need two-sided discussions, and there undoubtedly are some, virtual discussion, I mean, in our work with the people at the Center for Autism Research, we're setting up now to collect interviews where the clinician is in one place and the patient is someplace else. And we have to do that because of the pandemic. We can't, the patients can't at the moment come into the clinic, and the clinicians can't at the moment go to the patient's houses. But actually, to the extent that it can be shown to work, it's a more efficient way to get data because it doesn't require the patients and their families to make a trip to the clinic, and it doesn't require extra rooms in the clinic and so on.
Yeah, it's the good side of this pandemic. Okay. There's another question. This is Kiria. She asks you if there is any study on prosody in autism. She says that they have a monotonous speech despite of presenting normal hearing, and they have an altered central auditive processing. So if you have any, or if you know of any studies, or if you in your group, if you develop some studies on their prosody.
Well, what we found is looking at intonation first, and in English, which is the only language where we've looked at autism, we find actually that their pitch range is more variable. Not every individual's pitch range is more variable, but across the category. So what this seems to mean is that there are some patients who do have monotonous speech, but there are some patients who seem to have inappropriately up and down, to go up and down inappropriately, to have inappropriately sing-song speech. Or perhaps to be monotonous when they shouldn't be, or to be sing-song when they shouldn't be. It's a little hard to tell. In terms of timing, what we find is that the ASD patients, and again treating them as a group, speak somewhat more slowly. It's not a big difference, but it is a difference. But again, I'm a little bit reluctant to leave it at these general group means or group medians. And the reason is that there are lots of different subtypes, especially linguistically. So within autism, there are some people who are basically nonverbal or subverbal. They can hardly talk.
Yeah.
And there are others at the other end who are sort of hyperverbal. Who, you can't shut them up, or they, at a young age, they exhibit the so-called little professor syndrome. You ask an adolescent what their favorite movie is, and there might be someone diagnosed with autism who says, and hardly talks, and someone else who says, I do not ordinarily indulge in such activities. And those are both abnormal because you don't expect a 10-year-old to talk in either of those ways. But they're very, very, very different. And obviously, if you lump everybody together and just take the mean, you're going to get strange stuff.
Yeah. It's difficult, even to make clusters of people, way of answering or developing language. Then there is a greeting and a question from Eleonora Cavalcante Albano. She says, hello, Mark. Eleonora from the good old times at Bell Labs. Thank you for the great talk. Would you care to talk about what is available about speech sound disorders in children?
Well, there are certainly thousands of published papers. So, if you go on Google Scholar and search for some set of words like that, you'll get lots and lots and lots of papers going back 100 years or so, or certainly going back 50, 60, 70 years.
Okay.
And of course, there are many kinds of disorders. There, apart from the things that we've talked about, there are speech impediments, there's stuttering, there's specific language disorder. Of course, there's hearing disorders, and so on. So it's a very, very complicated situation. I don't know of a good sort of single summary for all the things that can go wrong with speech and language in children. I think you would have to divide it up, into several subparts, but then you could find recent reviews.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. There's just another question. If you there is Raquel. She asks you, may we also consider data from reading aloud, collecting in the classroom as a kind of inadequate data? I think because you talked a lot about speech data, talking, like narrating stories, casual conversation, answering questions. But what about reading in the classroom? Can we use these tools? I think that this is what Raquel asks. Can we use these tools and evaluate as adequate reading, inadequate reading? Because this is a very problematic here in Brazil.
Certainly. Well, I mean, there are several dimensions here. One dimension is simply learning to read. So in the United States, certainly we have a significant problem, not just in the early grades, but continuing through high school, of not just quote unquote dyslexic students who under the best of approaches would need special attention in order to become fluent readers, but lots of students who should be able to read, who never really become good readers. And of course, I'm not now talking about reading out loud, but just reading for meaning, coping with text. Now, independent of that, there are certainly people who can read perfectly well to themselves for meaning, but who are not good at reading out loud. You wouldn't want them reading a story to you. And that could be because their reading isn't fluent, but it could just be because they're not very good at making the structure of the message plain in the way that they read. And that might be something about their language facility. I mean, maybe they would be that way if they were telling a story, but maybe they wouldn't be that way if they were telling a story. And this is just something about about reading. And I don't know, actually, and I'm not sure that anyone does, because as I said in the beginning, education is one of the areas where we don't really have the kind of data that we should have. And reading is certainly one aspect of that, but there are many others. There's, teaching mathematics, there's teaching history, teaching biology, whatever. One of the things that a good teacher is able to do is to figure out what's going on with each individual student and to adjust the work that they give that student to help them make progress. So that you're not loading them up with stupid stuff that they can easily do. So you're not throwing things at them that are beyond what they're capable of, so they're not making any progress. So if there's not only what they know and what they don't know, but there's also things that they think they know that are wrong.
Yeah.
And you would like to be able to diagnose those and fix those. I've been hoping so far without success, that as we began having more online educational tools, that the things that happened with information extraction and document search and speech understanding and so on would begin to apply in that domain as well, that with scale we would get better performance. But it hasn't really happened yet because researchers don't have the scale in that area.
Okay, from the audience, I think I got all the questions. I think you answered all of them. Thank you so much. And I just wanted, no, sorry, there was one question someone asked again, if you could repeat. I think it's ADNI. This person asked, what's the name of the site here? Sarah, Professor, may you mention again the name of that website? It was www.speechbiomarkers.com. Is it correct?
That's speechbiomarkers.org, actually.
Okay.
That's our site for collecting data in this experiment. For ADNI, the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, that is ADNI. Is that an L or an O? Good question. Anyway, if you type ADNI into Google or Bing or something, it'll be there.
Okay, thank you so much. Another just a comment about you talked about the cookie theft, the picture. Yeah, I'm happy to see that it's the problem that we have when we look for stimuli is that, for instance, this one picture, without having scenes, a sequence of scenes, what we see with patients is that in general, they just describe the picture instead of giving a narrative of the story. Yes. Yeah, so it's interesting.
Another reason to want to have animation or perhaps a sequence of scenes is that you'd like for people to be able to use smartphones and other devices with small screens. And so you don't want to have a big complicated picture that they have to interpret on this tiny little screen. You'd rather show either a short animation or a sequence of stills and have them narrate what happens in that sequence.
Yeah.
We haven't done that yet, but for example, Tan Li at Chinese University of Hong Kong has done some stuff of a similar kind using a scene sequence. I think other people have done that as well.
Okay. And something, just to conclude, something that I found very interesting is that this type of research, in fact, started by someone asking the linguists to do this field, to join this field, which first came funding, and then we were kind of we doubt a little bit, and now we see how promising this field is, how it is emerging, blooming, and so many different aspects can be still exploited. Yes. So it's a nice field for us as linguists to join and to contribute for the worldwide research in different areas with clinical population, with all over the ages and the lifespan.
Absolutely. Not even more.
Okay, so then Dr. Liberman, thank you so much for this brilliant talk. We thank the audience. We'd like to highlight the importance for the audience to become an associate member of ABRALIN to strengthen our area and engage our community in this project. And we'd also like to invite the audience to keep on attending and promoting this project of Linguists Online. And so thank you again, Dr. Liberman. Thank you all.